Yeah, I just want to mention here before we start our presentation that it is our policy to record the meetings, and it is really for the benefit of those that are not able to log in on the night. We put the recording up on our website. So if you go into the Kilbrittain Historical Society website, you can see the range of meetings that we have had. And you can log into any one of those meetings and listen to them in your own time. So just so that everybody is aware that they are being recorded. Okay, so Liz, I'm going to transfer across to you, and we'll have a quick chat afterwards. So thank you very much, Liz.
Thanks a million, Sean. And I'm just going to share my screen now. And now let's see. Okay, so Sean, can you see that?
I can indeed. Yeah.
Okay. Brilliant. Okay, so just like to say a huge thank you to Sean and Niall for organising tonight and for inviting me to talk to the Kilbrittain Historical Society. Yeah, so the talk that I'm going to give tonight is about the Hales Brothers and, well, I suppose the Hales family and the Irish Revolution. And I suppose, as you can tell from this accent, I am not from Cork, but the story of the Hales Brothers has always fascinated me from when I first really had an interest in Irish history. It was the Civil War that really grabbed my attention, and the Hales Brothers always are mentioned in that they symbolize the whole tragedy of the Civil War. Yeah, there was very little that was written about them. Peter Hart, in his book The IRA's Enemies, has a chapter about them, but they're always mentioned as part of the greater story. It was never their story, and that sort of just piqued my interest and started this, God, what's it now? Probably 15 years journey of research about the family, which culminated in the thesis, which then culminated in the book. And I have to say, the support that I got from the people of West Cork was truly, truly amazing. And I'm still finding out things about the Hales family, especially with the release of archives from military archives, and they're a fantastic resource. So that's just a little bit of background there, but we'll get stuck in. So I suppose to begin with, like a lot of young people of that generation, the Hales family, the siblings, they were a politicized generation, certainly from their fathers, their mothers. And if we look at the Hales family, their father Robert, he was born towards the end of the famine, and we definitely know that when it comes to West Cork, the impact the famine had on the people, it was devastating. And in memory, it had a huge effect, and that memory was passed down to the next generation. So many young men and women who became involved in the revolutionary movement had grown up, listened to the stories of the famine, listened to the stories of evictions, the stories of the land war, and so on. And it awakened something in them. And in my mind, the Haleses were going to do something anyway, whether it was to do with the land. In this case, it was to do with the revolutionary movement, the struggle for Irish freedom. But they were a very politicized family, and that certainly comes from their father Robert. And pretty much it's a lot of them. You have Tom, Sean, Robert, William, Donald in Italy, and of course then Madge, who herself did join Cumann when that was set up, but then later left, because we do see that with a lot of women that joined the revolutionary movement, the nature of their work, they pretty much had to be invisible. So a lot of women like Madge were told to leave the organization, so there literally would be no paper trail on them. But very early on, you can see their activism, and it's personal, because in 1907, their father, Robert, who had cattle, the cattle were seized by the sheriff, taken to Bandon Pound, and Sean and Tom and the entire family were not happy with this and were determined to make a stand. And further efforts, when they raided the pound to steal back the cattle, Sean and a few others were arrested, and they received 2 weeks imprisonment for their efforts. Now, it made the newspapers, And we just have this from the Cork Examiner on the 22nd of May 1907 about the court case. And just to read out a little bit to you, but police court proceedings. Yesterday, a special court held in the courthouse in Bandon before Mr. A.G.W. Harold Hacknell, three men were charged by D.I. Langhorne was unlawfully and forcibly breaking into the pound at Bandon and rescuing cattle that were rightfully seized and impounded there by the sheriff's bailiff. Those cattle, as has already been reported, belonged to Mr. Robert Hales, a respectable farmer residing at Knocknacarra, a distance of about 4 miles to the east of the town of Bandon. The defendants are John Hales, the son of Robert, John Deasy, a farmer's son residing at Derrycool and a tenant on the Arnott estate, and James Donovan, a labourer residing at Gallows Hill in Bandon. But it wasn't just the three that were involved in that operation that day. This was like an event that involved a lot of their neighbours. It's like a forerunner to what would become or what would happen in 1914, 1915 when the volunteers were set up. So a lot of activism going on in the early days. But we have this then huge shift, a massive, massive political awakening in 1912 when Home Rule was finally put in the statute books, which would give Ireland limited independence. And with that realisation, the Ulster Protestants, the Unionists, decided that this was not acceptable. They would refuse to be separated from Britain. And the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, was set up basically to resist by force of arms, if the British government tried to make them become part of an All Ireland or be part of a parliament in Ireland. Now, so there was no one to protect Home Rule. So we have the Irish Volunteer Force being set up in 1913, soon after the Ulster Volunteer Force were set up. And another organisation in Dublin was the Irish Citizens' Army. So around the same time, you have all of these organisations being set up. But with the Irish Volunteers primarily, it's a defensive body set up to ensure that Home Rule would be introduced. In the background, of course, you had men like Tom Clark, Patrick Pearse, Sean McDermott, and so on. Certainly Tom Clark and McDermott, who saw the Irish Volunteers as their army because they, as members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, that secret organisation who are solely dedicated to achieving Irish independence by any means necessary, they saw in the Irish Volunteers a ready-made army. Tom was the first of the family to join the Irish Volunteers in Cork, and there we have him there, looking quite dapper, circled there, amongst all members or other members of the first members of the Cork Irish Volunteers. But he knew that he could raise a company, and he wasn't backwards about coming forwards, because he writes to Terence McSweeney, the vice commandant of the Cork Brigade, and says that he can raise a force, he can raise a company in Ballinadee, and he's given permission to do so. They became very, very experienced. They were very well respected, Cork Brigade. And if I can just ask is to mute if you haven't already, sorry. So Tom, although he's the younger brother, he is the OC of the Ballinadee Company. But then soon after, his brothers then all join. And we have, of course, his name is after, it's the Kilpatrick Company, I'm sure of it. There is a bridge at Bandon. MacDonald, Keys MacDonald. He is responsible for setting up the very first company. And then we have Tom following Stu. And then he is followed by his brothers. Now, when it comes to 1916, of course, Dublin dominates the story, but the Easter Rising was not to be a Dublin event. It was to be a nationwide event. Now, the volunteers, in the meantime, between them being set up and 1916, of course, they did split. The First World War broke out. John Redmond had sort of pledged the Irish volunteers to fight for Britain, and the reward would be Home Rule would be introduced. But while the majority followed Redmond, you had that nucleus that was left, and the hardcore that were left, and they retained the name the Irish Volunteers, and they believed that if you're going to fight for the freedom of small countries, well, that small country should be Ireland. But although it numbered, probably about 10,000 across the country, including then you have coming among the women's revolutionary movement had been set up at that stage. You have na Fianna Éireann and the Irish Boy Scouts as well, and the Irish Citizen Army, but it's about 10, 11,000 altogether. But the localities, the country had a role to play in 1916. The arms would be landed from Germany in Kerry. Those arms would be distributed to the southern brigades, and obviously to stop the British troops trying to get to Dublin, which would be the main centre of activity. They had to control the railways and stop those troops getting up. But of course, unfortunately, there was confusion a couple of days prior to the rise and the date that was meant to take place. The guns did arrive, but the British knew they were there. Roger Casement, who had come over, he was arrested, and the ship was sculled by the captain, and the guns never arrived. Now, that did not mean that there were not attempts by the Cork Brigade to rise up, to take part in the events, and Tom Hales was determined that the volunteers should participate. Now, there was the events in Cork with the Kent family, where Thomas Kent, there was a shootout when the police come to the family home. You have the policeman being shot and so on. There was a fear that something like that could happen. So you have this sort of an agreement brokered between the authorities and the volunteers that if the volunteers would surrender their arms, then they would not be arrested. Now, Tom Hales refused to surrender arms. He wouldn't take part in that. So he goes on the run. And there was a meeting in the Hales family home at Knocknacarry. You have Terence McSweeney there, and you have Robert and William Hales there, amongst many others. And the police came, and they were arrested. And they're amongst the 3,000 plus that are arrested after the rise. And so while you do have the events centred in Dublin, while you do have the leadership arrested, and that immediate group that took part in the activities in Dublin, you then have the mass arrests that follow after that. And we know that the British government made a lot of mistakes after 1916. The major one obviously was the executions of the leaders and the way they were carried out. But the mass arrest countrywide has a huge, huge effect, because while you did have people like the Haleses and McSweeney and so on that were active, there were a lot of people that didn't have anything to do with the events, and they're swept up. And where they all land is Richmond Barracks in Dublin, in Inchicore. So you have pretty much like what becomes the nucleus of the IRA being held in Richmond Barracks, and you've got a photograph of it there. So while Robert and Liam are arrested in that immediate swoop, Sean goes on the run, but he was arrested then later on in May. And those three are amongst the thousands that are deported, firstly to prisons across England, and then to Frongach in Wales, the big internment camp. And again, that was a major mistake, putting all these fellas together, because you have then this core of West Cork volunteers, and they become the nucleus of what develops into West Cork, the Cork Brigade and the West Cork Brigade in the War of Independence. So they're there for 6 months or so. And Ireland, they left in May, June 1916. It was hostile. Now, the people, it wasn't that they didn't support the rising, that they didn't support the idea of freedom, but much bigger things were happening. There was a war going on. Dublin City was destroyed. Civilians had been killed and wounded. Huge devastation. And it was a very hostile environment they left. They're being spat at and jeered at, and in some cases people are trying to get them to kill them, and the British soldiers are there to protect them. But December 1916, there was a huge shift, and a lot of that was down to the efforts of Cumann na Món, Women like Kathleen Clark, the widow of Tom Clark, who had been executed in 1916. A dependence fund had been set up for the families of those men who were executed, had been killed, and who were in prison. And propaganda. The Republicans were brilliant at propaganda. The British government were good at it. They didn't realize how good the Republicans would be at it, and they learned very, very quickly. So when they're released in December 1916 from Frongok, they come home to a very, very different Ireland. And it would have been so easy for the volunteers to pick up the guns again, to immediately go back to violence, because the IRB, although depleted, it did reorganize under Kathleen Clark. She kept everything together, and she sees people like Collins and so on, and starts to get them into positions where they can sort of dominate, and they do later on. But they don't. They decide to go down the Democratic route. So you have the series of by-elections in 1917, where Sinn Féin, which was the moderate nationalist party, thanks to the British government and the media labelling the rising as a Sinn Féin rising, the volunteers, the Republicans, have a ready-made political party for them. When they come home, they take it over, and it becomes the Republican Party. They win a series of by-elections throughout 1917. 1918, again, the British government score a major own goal here with the threat of conscription in 1918. So the war was still raging. Britain needed soldiers. She hadn't introduced conscription to Ireland in 1916 like she did in England, Scotland and Wales, but desperately needed men. So they decided, let's introduce conscription. The response they got from the country was an overwhelmingly loud no. You have moderate nationalists, you have Labour activists, diehard Republicans, all coming together under that one umbrella of the anti-conscription campaign. It's a huge success. All across the country, people take the national pledge. There's a general strike in April all across the country. The country comes to a standstill. You have Law na Mon in June, where the women of Cumann Mon, of the Women's Workers Union, of all of these associations, they make their own stand and have their own pledge. Now, you have this rise because, again, this alerts people and gets people politically aware. And there's a huge sort of support for Sinn Féin. And in response to this, the government decides to try to sort of stop Sinn Féin in their tracks, is to come up with this completely fabricated idea of the German plot, where Sinn Féin, the Republicans, were in cahoots with the Germans again. There was going to be another rising, so they were going to stop it before it started. So just arrest all of the key Sinn Féin figures. And who is on their list? Sean Hales. So the police come looking. There's mass arrests in and around the 18th of May 1918. Now, men like Collins and Harry Boland and Carol Brewer, they had got word that these raids were coming, but men like De Valera said, let them come. It's a complete fabrication, and we can use this to our advantage. But while he's arrested and imprisoned, men like Collins, Harry Boland aren't. But the police come looking for Sean. And this happens in mid-May, soon after the arrests up in Dublin. And there's a great account in the witness statements where the Sean is at home, Madge is there, their cousin Hannah is there. You've got William and Tom there in a neighbour's house. Sean insisted on staying in his own home. The police come, and Sean basically is just sort of caught in his house. Their elderly father is there. Madge somehow manages to get into the room that Sean is in while the police are there. She closes doors. Their little cousin is told, get to the neighbour's house, I think it's the Fitzgeralds, get to their house, or the McCarthy, sorry, and get Tom and William and the lads back. And they do, but there's only a handful of them. And what they do is they spread out across the fields and start shouting to each other. So it makes it look like the whole volunteer company coming for the police. And you can see from this report that made the newspapers, it says a force of 8 armed policemen motored to Knocknacarra to effect the arrest of Mr. John Hales, a prominent Sinn Féiner. The latter, however, succeeded in escaping from them, because when they're coming, with Madge's help, Sean was able to dart out. He could have shot a policeman. His father urged them not to, and Sean just goes. But a visit was then paid to the lodgings abandoned on Mr. Hugh Thornton, secretary of the local Sinn Féin club, but he was not to be found. So they're trying to do this mop up, get all the prominent Sinn Féiners into custody. 2 constables have been suspended on alleged refusal to obey orders during the proceedings, and a 3rd constable, it is stated, has handed in his resignation. So that quick thinking of Tom and William and so on, spreading out, making it look like there's 30 or 40 fellas coming to help Sean, it did strike fear into the police, and as you see there too, refused to carry out orders. But Sean, from that moment, has to go on the run. Really, from 1916, the family are on the radar of the authorities, and that just grows and grows and grows over the next few years. So 1918, it ends with the 1918 general election, where you have Sinn Féin riding on the success of the by-elections in 1917. They dominate. They obliterate the Irish Parliamentary Party. It is no longer a force to be reckoned with. You have, out of the 104 or 5 seats, sorry, numbers are wrong here, but Sinn Féin wins 75. The majority of those put forth in that election, of course, were in custody. But again, this is a huge, huge propaganda coup for the Republican movement. So one of the things that Sinn Féin sort of promised was that if they were elected, they would not take their seats in Westminster. They would represent the Irish people in a parliament in Ireland. And the date was set 24th of January 1919. The Parliament, the Dáil, would meet for the first time. That was the only thing that was meant to dominate the newspaper that day. But by pure coincidence, on the very same day, you have members of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade, number of volunteers, Dan Bray and Sean Tracy, they decided to seize gelignite from the RIC, who'd be escorting that consignment to a quarry, and they shot the policeman. And it's by pure coincidence that happens on the very same day, but that is seen as the official beginning of the War of Independence. And at this time, numbers in the volunteers, who are still called the volunteers at that stage, they're rising. Cork is too big. Like you can see, there was one brigade, there was one Cork brigade, one Dublin brigade, but Cork was so massive. So it was decided in 1919 by Collins and GHQ in Dublin to reorganise the brigade, so make them smaller, and that way you'll be more effective. Now, Tom had already proven himself what he could do, and he was appointed. The Cork was split into 3 brigades, so you have the 4th, 2nd and 3rd, and Tom was given command of the 3rd West Cork Brigade. You have Sean taken over from him as the commanding officer of the band and battalion, because the battalions or the brigades are made up of battalions, companies make up your battalions, and William took over as the OC of the Ballinadee company. So there you have 3 of the brothers being in direct leadership. So Tom, overall command, Sean, overall command, abandoned the battalion, and then Liam, OC of the Ballinadee company. And then as the war heats up, which happens very quickly because you have barrack attacks, you have ambushes on police, the authorities are taken completely off guard, and the RIC in the country are the focus of the volunteers to get weapons and also to make them leave the vicinity, because you've got peppered across this country hundreds of barracks, and they become the focus of attack. And it's very successful for the volunteers, because by attacking those barracks, the RIC retreat to the bigger towns, the bigger villages, the bigger cities, leaving vast areas in the control of the volunteers. And later on, we have the formation of the flying columns. And in West Cork, the most famous flying column of ever, Tom Barry becomes the commanding officer of the 3rd West Cork Brigade flying column. So here in West Cork, you have a very active brigade, but then you have in that a very, very active flying column, and they do dominate the story of the War of Independence. So 1919, it's the IRA, the volunteers that have the advantage. They do become known as the Irish Republican Army. They swear the oath of allegiance to the Dáil. But early 1920, the authorities, they get sort of to grips with the situation. They begin to reorganize. And 1920 really is a traumatic period. It is so dark, and it just gets worse as the year goes on. March 1920, the Lord Mayor of Cork, Thomas McCourtain, as you all very well know, he was shot and killed in front of his wife, his heavily pregnant wife, at his home. And the thing was, what really makes him a target, not only was he the OC, had he been the OC of the Cork Brigade, in 1920 you had local elections. So whereas Sinn Féin won 1918, the general election, where the real power, of course, is at the local level, you had a series of local elections in 1920 in January and June. The British government introduced proportional representation, thinking it was too confusing for the Irish people to understand. Sinn Féin educated the people on how proportional representation worked and turned it to their advantage. So Sinn Féin dominate again. They sweep the board in January and June, and people like Thomas McCourtain, Sean Hales, they're elected to the local boards, the rural district boards, and so on. But many of those men are then become Lord Mayors. Thomas McCourtain is one example. He was the Lord Mayor of Cork, and on the night of the 20th of March 1920, he was shot dead by men with blackened faces in front of his heavily pregnant wife. That event is followed by the arrival of the Black and Tans. So two forces arrived in Ireland in 1920. The Black and Tans, which were to sort of reinforce the police, because at that stage it was very difficult to get people to join the police because they were being targeted so much by the IRA. It was made up of men, veterans of the First World War, and they were a permanent police force. So these were going to be here for as long as Britain was ruling Ireland. But then July 1920, you have the arrival of the auxiliaries, a much smaller force. And that was made up of men who were officers in the British Army in the First World War, a temporary force. So they were only going to be in existence for the duration of this conflict. It wasn't a war. The British government would not call it a war. It was a police action. Hence, you have these bodies being sent here. But there were also British military regiments across Ireland as well. Some more notorious than others, and certainly down in West Cork. But when it comes to the Black and Tans, the auxiliaries, and certain regiments, they left a trail of devastation wherever they went. And when it comes to West Cork, who were the IRA up against? So you have the RIC, you have the Black and Tans, you have Cape Company auxiliaries, and of course then you have the Essex Regiment, and you have Major Percival, who is in charge there. And they were determined to crush the IRA by any means necessary. Certainly with the auxiliaries, that was their role. And as I said, their presence is felt pretty much immediately. And the way the War of Independence goes, it's like the IRA have successes, then the British hit back. They have successes, then the IRA hit back. And that's the nature of this conflict. And in mid 1920, the British are reorganising, and they begin to have successes very, very quickly. And the IRA do suffer some heavy losses, and West Cork in particular, with the arrest of Tom and Pat Hart on the 27th of July 1920. So they were discovered at Lorden's farmhouse, I think it was. And the story is well known. It was documented at the time. Fair play. Tom did actually write an account of what happened. But when he and Pat Hart, who was the quartermaster of the 3rd West Cork Brigade, when they were discovered, they were arrested by the Essex Regiment. They were brought to Bandon Barracks, and there they basically were treated horrifically. Now, I won't describe everything, but you can see here from this newspaper report in 1920 October, you can just see the headline there: awful story of torture, London journalists report of frightful Irish happenings. As I said, it's well documented, and you can see this photograph that was taken by the military, just the state of the two men. They clearly have been beaten, and Pat Hart here is holding up a Union Jack. Tom, they had tried to make him do that. He knew what it was, the flag. He wouldn't hold her up. Pat Hart, you can see that he's pretty much very traumatized there, and he's holding it up. Whether he knew what he was holding up, we don't know. But just an example of what the men endured. This is a portion, an extract from Tom's statement, and it's a very, very long statement. So basically, what he says is, Captain A also put the pincers on my sides, but my senses were becoming quite numb. So after they'd been beaten, after they'd been threatened with execution, the torture went on. The men were separated. This happened not while they're together in this room, separate rooms. After that, and finding that I would answer no questions, he told me I'd be shot at dawn. Lieutenant B then untied my hands and told me to pull up my trousers. I did so, and my trousers were sopping with blood. Captain A said the court is closed for the finding. Lieutenant B then handed me a terrific punch in the face. I said I would not defend myself. I would not give them an excuse to say I had hit them. Lieutenant B hit me several times in various parts of the body, but especially in the face, and he broke the 4 front teeth in my upper jaw. He then knocked me down on the ground. I was absolutely exhausted and nearly fainted, and my senses were beginning to go. He hit me on several occasions while I was on the ground. After a few minutes, one of the officers said, "That's enough." I was then dragged up and led out of the room to the room where Hart was, and then Hart endured the same. Now, the thing was, there was an inquiry done into this, and there was a response from the authorities. And in relation to Lieutenant B, it was said that Hales, and excuse the language here, Hales had called him an English bastard or something, and he gave him 1 punch in the face, and then when they saw what was happening, they stopped it. Now, you can clearly see from the previous photograph, the men were beaten. God knows what they were like when they were interrogated in the barracks. There are reports from the doctors who treated Hales, and he said that he'd never seen wounds like it. Now, the 2 men received 2 years in prison, and of course the story doesn't end there, because the effects of this treatment had a profound effect on Pat Hart. It was quite clear. There's letters from Arthur O'Brien to Michael Collins, because he had his people in England, in Pentonville, visiting them in the prison, keeping an eye on them. And you can see in the letters the deterioration of Pat Hart. This man is one of the interrogators, Captain Campbell Joseph O'Connor Kelly, and he actually went to England to interrogate the men further. Now, whereas Hales knew who he was, it seems to have had a terrible effect on Pat Hart, because the 2 men were being it had been after the shooting of an RIC policeman, and Kelly was saying to Hart that they were going to make sure he got charged and sentenced for the shooting of this RIC man, and it seems to have sent Hart over the edge. Unfortunately, he ends up in Broadmoor Asylum, and then he was brought home to Ireland, and he died in 1924. Now, after the arrest of Tom, you have Charlie Hurley taken over as commandant of the 3rd West Cork Brigade, but of course Sean, William, Liam are still very, very active. Now, whereas 1920, so that's the way it continues. So in July, August, certainly by October, the authorities, the Crown Forces thought they had the IRA on their knees. You have the big losses that continue. Sean Tracy shot in October in Dublin. Terence McSweeney, who succeeded McCurtain as the Lord Mayor of Cork, he dies on hunger strike. You have Kevin Barry being executed in Mountjoy Jail in November. And Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, is so confident that they are about to destroy the IRA that he makes his famous speech at the Lord Mayor's banquet that we have murder by the throat. But then the IRA hit back with Bloody Sunday, where Collins sends his men out to assassinate British agents. And then the following week, you have the Kilmichael ambush down in West Cork, where up to that point, the auxiliaries had believed that they were invincible. Kilmichael proved they weren't, and that's then followed by Dillon's Cross in December. Then we have the burning of Cork. And then January 1921 opens again. The IRA suffer some heavy losses, especially in Cork. You have Clonmult, you have Dripsy, you have a number of IRA men being executed. And again, it looks like the authorities are getting the upper hand. But then we come to March and you have events like the Crossbarry ambush. Now, before that, you had the Upton, the train ambush at Upton. You have Charlie Hurley, who was Tom's successor. He's killed at Upton. But then March 1921, you have the Crossbarry ambush. So 104 men of the 3rd West Cork Brigade Flying Column, pretty much the elite of West Cork, including the Hales brothers. So you've got Sean, William, and Robert involved in this operation, who, against massive odds, ambush the military, the police, and they evade capture. It's a huge success, and here we have the Hales family at the center of this ambush. But all along, you have the reprisals taking place. So where there's ambushes, you know, people in the locality, local communities do suffer at the hands of the Crown forces, and you have the towns getting burnt all across the country. But also houses of prominent Republicans were being targeted, and the Hales family home becomes the target for the authorities. And this happens in March 1921. So actually just shortly before the Crossbarry ambush, you have the Hales family home being destroyed. Now, if you can imagine, and this would have been replicated all across the country. So there's their father, Robert, there's their mother, Madge Hales, who, while she's doing her Republican activities, you know, she's trying to organise gun running between Italy with her brother and Ireland. She's also keeping everything going at home, because the farm had to continue. And this is the other aspect we tend to forget about. Like, ordinary life did continue as well. So Madge is trying to keep it all together. And then the authorities come, the Crown forces come, and the family home is destroyed. It's a real personal way of striking at the family. And again, just to read this report from the newspapers, this from Skibbereen Eagle, Bandon farmhouse destroyed by fire. In the early hours of Saturday morning, the residence and furniture of Mr. Robert Hales Sr., a well-known and respected farmer of Knocknacoora, Bandon, were completely burnt. Mr. Hales, his wife and daughter, and a servant girl were the only occupants of the house, and it is stated that they got no time to live. And again, this story is replicated right across the country. Mr. Hales is an aged man, and it is stated he was unwell recently. About a year ago, the out offices, farm produce and implements of Mr. Hales were also burnt. The latest damage is estimated at several £1,000s. Now, this event has a detrimental effect on the health of their father, Robert Hales. And we'll sort of go back to that later on. But there is a direct hit. So not only have you got Tom now in custody, but now the family pretty much have nowhere to live. Madge has to try and get everything together and pretty much ends up living in a shed. But she keeps it going. So as the war progressed, because 1921, it did not look like either side would back down. The executions continue by the British. And in response to this, the IRA hit back. And they decide that, well, it's tit for tat. So if the British will continue to execute IRA men, well, then they're going to kidnap prominent loyalist figures and hold them and then possibly execute them. Now, there's an order given in June that highly prominent figures, in this case, Lord Bandon, the Earl of Bandon, he was to be kidnapped, and his house, like obviously God's house. The house wasn't meant to be destroyed, but Sean led this attack. And when he went to the house, when the IRA went to the house, they couldn't immediately locate Lord Bandon. But Sean said that seeing as though his house had been destroyed, he was going to destroy the house of Lord Bandon. Now, they did discover Lord Bandon and he was kidnapped, and basically they're holding him hostage so that if any further IRA are executed, well then Lord Bandon would be executed himself. And again, makes the newspapers all across the country. You've got the headlines like that we see. And here we have, of course, Castle Bernard, which was completely destroyed by fire. Lord Bandon, He was transferred all across West Cork. They had safe houses everywhere. So he'd be only in one place for a short time. The police could not find him. No one could find Lord Bandon. Now, he was kept safe and eventually he was released. But despite their best efforts, there's pleas in the newspapers and so on trying to find from other prominent civilians. And no one knew where Lord Bandon was. And then July 1921, it ends. The War of Independence, it's over. Now, a huge thing, and it is a huge coup for the Republicans in that prior to November 1920, there had been peace feelers, they were sending them out. But the British government always put conditions on any thoughts of talks, negotiations. They must give up Collins. They must give up Mulcahy. The IRA must disarm, surrender their weapons. You fast forward then to July 1921. The British government, they're the ones that ask for the truce, and there's no conditions. This was a huge, huge coup for the Republicans. There's meetings on the 8th of July, the week leading up to the 8th of July, and finally a truce is agreed that would come into effect on the 11th of July, 1921 at noon. And it was over. And this photograph, you can see, it just captures the whole joy, what the whole country must have been feeling, that peace was here. It was over. But for the likes of the Hales family and so on, so many like them, what were they going to come home to? In their case, they had nothing, as in their family home was gone. Their farmhand had been killed earlier by the Crown forces. But they came out of hiding. There was celebrations all over. And Lord Bandon, he was released. So he was safe. And here you have, again, the newspaper reports that, he none the worse of kidnapping experience. He actually talks about that he was treated quite well by his captors. And he did put in a claim. There's lots of compensation claims put in at this time. And you can see here that in October, he put in a claim for £100,000 for the burning in Castle Bernard. He got 61,905. He also put in a claim for 70,000 for destruction of furniture and valuables. And that was actually him and his wife, so 140,000. So he's awarded £45,091 for that. Lady Bandon is awarded £14,072 for that. Then he claims another 3,000 for personal injuries by being kidnapped, and said in evidence he was moved from house to house every second night. So there we get actually an idea of what it was like, what he actually experienced. Some nights he was unable to get to bed and sometimes walk 3 or 4 miles. He was put in a car and the jolting made him very sore. He was away 3 weeks and 1 day and lost 1 stone in weight. And the judge asked, were you well treated, Lord Bandon? In some cases I was better than others. The people were kind as far as they were allowed. Dr. Welby said Lord Bandon was a broken down man now, and he was awarded £1,500 for that. But he was safe. And the celebrations did continue. And we have, I suppose, like the end of the First World War and the Second World War, people had lived through this conflict. People had lost a lot of close friends, a lot of people. And you do have people getting married and coming on to IRA men and so on. And this photograph, if a picture can paint 1,000 words and capture happiness and sadness in all at the same time, it is this photograph of the wedding of Leslie Price and Tom Barry in August 1921. So Leslie Price, she's sent down to Cork, West Cork, to organise coming on. She falls in love with Charlie Hurley, who's killed at Upton, and then she marries his best friend, Tom Barry, when the truce, during the truce. But what this photograph shows is a moment of happiness, a moment of hope, but also it's the last possible time that all of these people would be together, because within 6 months they would be all fighting. Within less than a year they would physically be fighting each other. And in particular, one person, to the day of that photograph getting taken, and there he is there trying to hide himself, he would be dead in the Irish Civil War. And 3 people up from him is Sean Hales. So here we have West Cork and Dublin being united in this photograph, and for what is a happy occasion, but is also hugely sad photograph when we know what comes next. And it wasn't long coming, because during the truce, you have the treaty negotiations then begin in October 1921. Collins is one of the Irish plenipotentiaries sent over along with Arthur Griffith to negotiate the treaty. Now, these men and women had been fighting for a republic. Ireland had been partitioned with the Government of Ireland Act in 1920. The British government were threatening immediate and terrible war if in December the Irish plenipotentiaries did not sign the treaty. The treaty was signed in the early hours of the 6th of December 1921. The oath of faithfulness that had to be taken to the British monarch was a huge, huge bone of contention. The treaty is signed, brought home to Ireland, and immediately the Republican movement split. But one of the aspects of the treaty being signed was that those in custody, so those IRA men coming among, Republicans who were in custody, they would be released under the terms of the treaty being signed. So men like Tom Hales returned home. Now, this is actually an interview that Sean gave with the Irish Independent newspaper shortly after his release, about 12 days after his release. It was released on the 12th of December 1921. And in this, he's talking about the way they were treated in prison. And again, this story is replicated not just across the prisons in England, but also, you go back in time to the Fenians and so on. Republican prisoners were sort of targeted for particularly harsh treatment by the authorities. But Tom Hales and his comrades in prison, all across the prisons, they saw themselves as political prisoners. Terence McSweeney had made the ultimate sacrifice for that belief, and they protested. And you can see here what he's talking about is the way they were treated. He says that news of the truce came to them and inducements were held out, but they held stubbornly to the view that they should be treated as prisoners of war or as political prisoners. Mr. Hales went on to describe scenes within the prison when more than one of his comrades was sent to the silent cell and a straitjacket. One of them refusing food for several days. He was eventually sent to hospital. The protest continued, every one of the prisoners refusing to don convict garb, until at last it was a food strike, at which the authorities became alarmed. Then came an IRA military order from within the prison for every man to hand out his coat and cap to each prison official commanding a landing. From that point, said Mr. Hales, every one of my comrades refused to wear prison uniform or to obey prison discipline. He himself was examined by the Pentonville prison doctor. He was told you would be removed to Portsmouth. I was handcuffed and told to put on prison clothes. I refused and was then taken in an overcoat on the way to Portsmouth, where I was unconditionally released on December 12th. But before he came home, as you can see from the next part of this, what he says, Mr. Hales further told the Irish Independent representative that since his release, he had visited Broadmoor Lunatic Asylum, where he found 5 of the Irish prisoners who had been either at Pentonville, Portland, or Wormwood Scrubs closely confined. 3 of the 5, he said, are hopeless lunatics. And it's unfortunate and tragic that most likely one of those was Pat Hart, who was arrested with him in July. Now, the Civil War, getting back to where I started, I suppose, where it is said, and it is totally accurate, that the Hales family symbolised the whole tragedy of the Irish Civil War because they were split down the middle. Everyone was affected by the split that came. But in the case of the Hales family, we have Sean, seen here, and Madge accepting the treaty and then rejecting the treaty. We have Tom, Liam, Roberts, and Donald, who was in Italy. He was the Republican envoy in Italy at the time. So split right down the middle. And despite the best efforts of the IRA, there was no sort of way conflicts could be averted. Now, you do have the IRA convention held in March. So Cumann na Món were the first to hold a convention in Dublin in February 1922. As to whether they as an organisation should accept or reject the treaty, they overwhelmingly reject it. There's a handful really that go pro-treaty, that accept it. But then the IRA hold their convention in March. Now, this convention was banned by Arthur Griffith. He told Richard Mulcahy to basically ban it, and any IRA man who attended it basically would have no support. And this is like a clear sort of indication, where is your loyalty? And we have here the members of the 4th Southern Division who all reject the treaty. So it's a clear division there. And there we have Tom Hales in amongst that photograph. Again, the efforts continue. You have Tom being on the executive of the IRA, where they're trying to sort of find a solution to avert the conflict. In the meantime, you have the shootings, the killings in Dunmanway and West Cork. Tom and Liam Deasty are in, and Florrie Dunny, I think it is, are in Dublin. When they hear what's going on, they make their way back down to Cork. And Tom himself issues orders that anyone, if there's any member of the Protestant community shot, Tom would deal with those who are responsible, as in they themselves would be executed. So you have all of this going on. Sean, he's involved in attempts to try to broker or prevent the split from actually getting worse. But despite their best efforts, they can't avoid it. And on the 28th of June 1922, the Civil War begins in Dublin. You have the shelling of the forecourts that was occupied by the anti-treaty IRA. One person that ends up in the forecourts, who'll feature in the story later on, is Dick Barris, who's also in this photograph. I think that's him there. I could be wrong. Liam Lynch had been there, but he made his way back down to Cork. The fighting in Dublin lasts for about 10 days. And then with the National Army, the pro-treaty side taking control of Dublin, they thought that it was all over, not realising that Liam Lynch, who was in Dublin, had left for Cork and was really entrenched down there. And what becomes known as the Munster Republic, the fighting centres around Cork and the south. And very soon after, you have that massive loss, the death of Collins down in West Cork. And again, the Hales family, they're there. So we have the meeting. And De Valera meets with Liam Lynch. Liam Deasty talks about this in his book, Brother Against Brother. And they know that Collins is on this tour of Cork. He's traveling all around West Cork. He's met with Emmett Dalton and so on, and he's with him, and they're going to Skibbereen and everywhere else. They pass through. They're met by Dennis Long, I think it is. They get lost, and they don't know that Long is a member of the IRA. He alerts the IRA, the anti-treaty IRA, that Collins is in the vicinity and an ambush is planned. And who is in charge of that ambush, of course, is Tom Hales. One of the last people that Collins meets is Sean, who is in command in Bandon. And they meet in what's now the Munster Arms Hotel. And we have this photograph, the last photograph taken of Collins before he sets off on that journey back to Cork. But the roads had been blocked. It was so dangerous, and they had to go a certain route. Now the ambush party had been waiting a long time. There was a mine. Tom had actually decided to call off the ambush, and they were actually dismantling the mine when the convoy arrives. And in the fight that happens, it's Collins. He's the only one that gets shot. Now, the anti-treaty side knew that someone had been shot. And again, there's a great description in Liam Deasy's book where later on, when they're in Murphy's farmhouse, and it's revealed that it was Collins that was actually killed. And you have the younger men that are elated by this. This is amazing news. They're joyous at this. But the likes of Tom Hales, Liam Deasty, Tom Hales just puts his head in his hands, and it's like they realise that what's going to come next, there's no stopping it. Because in a way, I suppose Collins was like a buffer that was trying to keep a lid on a very explosive situation. And it is sort of proven that because what happens later on, it just escalates and escalates. However, you do have they were blessed really, because it could have been a double loss for the Collins family, because the very next day after his body was brought up to Dublin, you have Sean, his brother, making his way up to Cork. And of course, the roads had been mined and the roads had been blockaded and so on. And he was actually arrested by the anti-treaty IRA and took him to a farmhouse. And you have young volunteers that are talking about killing his brother, Michael Collins. They're also talking about killing Buckshaw Hales, as in Sean Hales. And Tom steps in and he basically ensures that Sean Collins is allowed to go free. But they have younger men threatening the brother of their commanding officer that they were going to actually shoot Sean Hales. But thankfully for Tom stepping in, it wasn't a double loss that the Collins family did suffer. And of course, Collins was buried then up in Dublin. But Tom met Sean that night. And I would love to see the account, the report that he wrote. But apparently he did give Sean a full account of actually what happened at Bailnablaw. But despite the fact that they were on opposite sides, they were still able to keep in contact with each other, despite being on that different side politically. And there we have then a tribute from Sean to Collins. And again, Collins was loved by so many. And just to read out a little bit of this, because he was one of the last people to see him. And what he says was that you have Sean Hales. He arrived in Cork in the course of an interview, paid a glowing tribute to the memory of Michael Collins. Nobody said appreciates more than I do the brilliant service of Michael Collins. I've been in the fight from its earliest days, and I've had ample opportunity of knowing his great qualities and ability. We all deplore his loss very deeply, but there is no feeling of despair so far as the full fruition of ideals is concerned. His last words to me were that he did not want to injure one Irishman, or even to humiliate in the least the proud spirit of those of his countrymen who may have been opposed to him. He had great faith in the respects for opponents and was grieved to think that a single Irishman could be found who would cast down the sincerity of his motives for the uplift of his country. And then he went on to say, because this is about the anti-treaty IRA, I do not doubt the honesty of purpose of the men opposed to us, but I do doubt the wisdom of their methods. There was a time when the destruction which had been going on was the military necessity, but it is no longer such, and every atom of the buildings and bridges now destroyed was Ireland's own property. Referring to the National Army, he said that its organisation was perfect, and it was, if anything, more determined to maintain and enforce the will of the people. What pained Michael Collins most was that in order to enforce the people's will, he had to enter into a bloody conflict with those whom he desired to shield and protect. Now, Sean suspected something. He didn't quite believe the official event or official version of what happened at Bailnablaw, and he was trying to discover what happened. Now, in the meantime, he is actually taken or engaging with battles with the anti-treaty IRA, some of his former neighbours, his friends, while trying to do this. John L. O'Sullivan was with him, and he talks about Sean, when they would come up against a party of anti-treaty IRA. In one case, they had he was armed with big cannons, and it's like, just don't aim it at them, just aim it above them. It's to scare them. He didn't actually want to kill what was his former friends. But there must have been huge worry on him with his brothers on the opposite side that were free, and especially Tom, because it was known that he was involved in the ambush where Collins was killed. And he most possibly feared that if he was caught, he would be killed. Both William and Tom were eventually arrested. William in September and then Tom in November. But he was safe. He was just put into custody. He was gotten out of harm's way and he was put into custody. So that was possibly huge pressure lifted off of Sean. And then Sean continues to look into and try to get an investigation, a proper investigation into the death of Collins. But he never gets to start that investigation, because on the 7th of December 1922, Sean was killed by the anti-treaty IRA. And this is a huge dark moment in the Civil War, because the moment that a line is crossed, and there is no going back. Now, the reason that how Sean ends up getting shot, assassinated, was that you had what the anti-treaty IRA called the murder bill, and you just have the members of the Dáil who voted on this. So basically, the provisional government had introduced a Special Powers Act, and it meant that if you're found with a gun, you could be executed. So a vote was taken on this, and it was passed. Now, Sean Hales, as a TD, he would have, if he was there, he would have voted. Don't know what way he would have voted, but he wasn't there that day the vote was taken. So he has nothing to do with this. But in response to this, the anti-treaty IRA then put out an order, basically, that anyone who signed this or voted for this, the legitimate targets, shoot them, kill them. And Pádraig O'Malley was one of those who voted for it. Now, his cousin owned the Ormond Hotel on the Quays. Sean was visiting him. O'Malley was the last count Corla of the Dáil. So he was in a position to maybe ask or raise the question of maybe starting an investigation into the death of Collins. The two men were coming out of the Ormond Hotel to make their way to the Dáil. And O'Malley gets in, Sean gets in, but then someone comes out who knew O'Malley and calls him back. He steps off the horse and carriage. At that same moment, out from a laneway just near the hotel, 2 or 3 members of the anti-treaty IRA come out shooting. And Sean, tragically, he is hit full force. He gets the whole impact, and literally Jervis Street Hospital is minutes away. He was dead before he arrived at the hospital. Now, in response to this, the provisional government, they came down very, very hard. But it is tragic what happens next, because you have the executions. Now, Sean's funeral, just put up this photograph, you got a massive funeral. Like in Dublin, you have thousands of people visiting the Pro Cathedral to see Sean, to pay their last respects to Sean before then he was brought back down to Cork, where he's buried in Inishannon in the family grave. But on the 8th of December, you have the executions. I'm just going to go back to that now in a sec, but here we have it in the newspapers: executed as a reprisal, and that's exactly what it was. Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Richard Barrett and Joe McKelvey are executed as a reprisal for the assassination of Sean, for the killing of Sean Hales. You have it here, and I just want to explain. Here we have the photographs there. Dick Barrett, we'll come back to him in a sec. Joe McKelvey, he was Ulster. We've got Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows. Each of these 4 men represent the province of Ireland. Joe McKelvey, Ulster; Rory O'Connor, Leinster; Liam Mellows is Connacht; and Dick Barrett is Munster. And Dick Barrett had been very good friends with Sean. He was quartermaster, and the family themselves wrote a letter saying that Sean would not have wanted Dick Barrett to be executed as a result of his killing. The thing was, none of these men had anything to do with Sean's death, with the shooting, with the killing of Sean, because they'd been in custody since June 1922, since the 4 courts fell. They had no control of what was going on the outside. And you just see it here. This is from a quote from President W.T. Cosgrave, saying, when asked why the reprisals, the executions happened, he stated that the night before Sean Hales was assassinated, he and the Minister for Defence had agreed that the time had come for clemency. But Sean's death changes everything. There was only one way to meet this campaign, he said, and that was to smash it. And those 4 are among the 77 executions that take place during the Irish Civil War. But just Tom being in custody, what was his thoughts on Sean's death? No doubt it had a huge impact, and he actually wrote a letter which was published in the newspaper, and just to read it out to you. This is from Hare Park Camp on the 10th, so 3 days after Sean was killed. He's writing a letter to his mother, and he says, "My dearest mother, as it was not possible for me to attend poor Sean's funeral, though it would have been my wish, I pray God may strengthen and comfort you all under this terrible cross. I can quite understand the terrible shock you all received on hearing of poor Sean's death, and moreover in so brutal a fashion. Again, may God comfort you all and the country he loved. I myself am going on well. Your loving son, Tom." Now, the thing was, there is a letter, and I did find it, that there was a letter written from the Dublin Brigade of the IRA to the West Cork IRA to state that Sean was not the target. O'Malley was the target, but he stepped off, and unfortunately, Sean was the one who was fatally wounded. But what impact did all of this have? Because there were people left at home. And Madge is still left at home. Madge is keeping it all together. So she's got 2 brothers in prison. Our brother Sean is being killed. There's another brother on the run. There's another brother in Italy. Her father's health is really, really impacted. And she has nothing. Like, she's literally living, you know, in a ruin. And she's trying to keep it together. And this letter that she wrote in 1923, it sums it up. And again, Madge is an example of what families had to endure at this time. But she's writing to W.T. Cosgrave because the family were desperate. If you can imagine, the breadwinners are gone, and Sean was the breadwinner. Tom was in prison. Liam was Liam was in prison, and Robert been on the run. So how could she actually keep things going? And she's writing to him, and she says, "I'll introduce myself. I'm Miss Hales, and I'm writing to you on a subject that gives me much pain. I understand that you have been a personal friend of our dearly beloved brother Sean. In dear Sean, we have all lost a father as well as a brother, as he had all responsibilities of this home on his hands. So Sean was the one in charge, looking after everything. And I need not tell you how lovingly he cared for us all and the bright hopes we had in him. Now, Mr. Cosgrave, I with pain must tell you that my mother finds it hard to meet our financial difficulties. My father is in the Osborne home in Blackrock, owing to his nerves having broken down from continued trouble and shock." So all of that, what happened the year before, including Tom's torture and arrest, and the house, of course, being destroyed. Since Easter week, he being in weak health, the strain was too awful. Now, she continues on, you will agree with me that I am right in asking to send to mother sufficient money to cover their father's expenses at the Osborne home, and also sufficient to let us get all comforts necessary for him when we bring him home in a week or so. Now, you understand that we, under ordinary circumstances, will be in a very independent position. Your friend, Mr. John Collins, will tell you this. Now, you as a gentleman will understand what I am conquering in writing this letter. You understand that none of my brothers here at home would write this letter, but I cannot look on at poor mother's heroic endeavours to meet her calls without being compelled by affection to write this. Poor mother, I believe, is the bravest and most patient of mothers, and she is so patiently bearing her very, very heavy cross. As an Irish girl to an Irish gentleman who understands and will respect my feelings, which are expressed in this letter, I have written this and feel sure you will respect it by writing me a satisfactory answer to it. They didn't get the answer they wanted. They did get some compensation for the house, but because Sean wasn't married, they didn't get a dependence pension. So literally they were, you know, in dire straits. But with everyone, like everyone else, they did manage to regroup, and they kept going, and they kept it together. The Civil War ended, and we have Tom being released, we have William being released, we have Robert coming home. But really, what were they coming home to? It wasn't the family home that they had all grown up in. Sean, their brother, was dead. The family home was destroyed. So much had happened. They had sacrificed so much for the cause of Irish freedom. Was it worth it? We don't know in their minds. I'm assuming that it was, but it was an awful high price that family paid. Bandon itself remembered Sean. There was the memorial unveiled to him in 1930, and it's a beautiful, beautiful memorial. And we have the photograph there of the unveiling of that memorial. And then up the other sides of town, of course, you have the memorial to the IRA. And what that shows is the whole sacrifice that community made, that all of these community made in the fight for Irish freedom. And I suppose when we look at the Civil War, what is really tragic is that at the end of the day, they all lie in the same ground, in the same soil, in the graveyards. A lot of them, when it comes to Civil War, having fought and died on opposite sides in that war, it's where they end up in the same plots of land. But they were able to come back from it. And this huge event in 1965, unveiling of the memorial to Michael Collins at Sam's Cross. And this is a really, really powerful photograph, because in this photograph, you have members of the squad. So Collins's men in Dublin, his right-hand men who would kill, who would die for their leader, beside the men that were involved in the ambush in which Michael Collins was killed. So here we have Tom Hales, we've got Liam Deasty here, Tom Barry, he wasn't involved in it, but then you have Paddy Lawson, a member of the Active Service Unit, you've got Vinnie Bourne, a member of the squad, Joe McGuinness here. Again, if a picture could tell a story, it is this picture, but it does show that their common love for their one-time leader is what brought them together. And just to go back to the point that I made, that we all end up in the same soil in Ireland. And just in terms of the Civil War, it was a huge, huge tragedy that we lost so many giants of the War of Independence as a result of the Civil War. And on that note, I would just like to say a huge thank you for listening to me. Thanks to Sean for all the technical support. Military Archives, fantastic resource. Just have a look at what they have, the pension files, the BMH witness statements, and the newspaper archives again are amazing. And then Mercer Press for all their support, Micheál Devlin for photographs and help with that, and Paul O'Brien as well. Everyone, if there's any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. And seriously, thanks a million for listening to me. Thank you.
Sure. Liz, give us. Yeah, there's different next questions. I don't know.
Sean, Sean, you keep on muting.
Okay, Liz, I don't know if, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Liz. I think as suspected, it was powerful. It's a fantastic amount of work that you've put into the whole thing, and the fluency and the way it flows, the ability to record dates, names, places. You know, you would shame a lot of us here on a very local level. So it's admirable, Liz, and thank you very, very much. And I think the attention of 80 people this evening in a small little village is testament to that. And again, thank you very, very much for your presentation. I did say we weren't going to do too many questions, but I think, you know, if somebody would like to join in, we'll keep it limited. And if anyone wants to join, they can just come in the normal way there, please. I can only just tell you this from the chat box that it is nothing, only congratulations, and everybody are very, very impressed with the presentation and everything that goes on there. Does anybody want to add anything there? Anyone from our own committee maybe even want to add something in?
Hi Liz, Triona here. I was just wondering about Madge Hales, and was she not ever in the Coming Man? Was she kind of higher up?
No, she was a member, but you won't find a paper trail on her, Trina. Like a lot of women were told that were members of Coming Man were told to leave it. And her being being a member of such a high profile family, she'd be known to the authorities. So she doesn't actually, you won't find her on a membership role. I haven't found her yet on a membership role, but she was coming on in the early days, but told to leave. And then she does the gun running between Italy and Cork, and there was the whole shipment that was meant to come through, and I know someone has done a lot of work specifically on that arms shipment, and while she's doing, like, she's gathering intelligence and so on, and while she's doing that, then she's keeping, you know, the farm going, looking after her mom and her dad, like, so. And again, that's replicated all across the country, and you see with that newspaper article, when they finally do come, it's at night, so it adds to that fear as well. So what Madge, like, she was formidable, and then to rebuild everything after it all. It's a huge testament to her abilities. But as much a Republican, and she was feisty, because there's a newspaper report, I think it's around March 1922. So when Dev and Griffith are sort of going on their lecture run, or the sort of the pro and anti-treaty campaign. No, it's actually 1920, could be 23 actually, because Sean was dead. And she tries to pull Dev off a platform and stuff, and she's like, saying, you are responsible for my brother dying. Like she wasn't afraid to stand up and let herself be heard. So a formidable woman. But in terms of membership, finding her in a membership, for coming on, I actually haven't found a Trina.
There's just
Okay,
one other question that's coming in again. As I say, it is all very congratulatory. Somebody's just asking, do we know, did Tom and Madge heal their differences?
Yeah, they did. Now the family thankfully were able to come back from it. And Tom ended up living in the rebuilt family home in Knocknacarra. Madge got married. And no, they were able to come back. It was probably the realization of what was actually lost. Like they made the ultimate sacrifice in Sean being killed. And could they risk losing another one, each other? I know Tom, like so many, they didn't talk about it to their children and stuff, because obviously it was too painful and so on. And I suppose now looking back, we would want to get those stories and stuff, but it was too painful. But they were able to come back, Sean. Thankfully, they were able to salvage their relationship. And even Sean and Tom, while it's all going on, Tom and Sean met. They kept up contact with each other, and Tom met Sean that night of Collins's when Collins died, and he gives him this report, and I just haven't seen. I've only seen an excerpt of it. I'd love to see the thing in its entirety, to know exactly what Tom talks about. So they, even within that conflict, Tom and Sean were able to keep their relationship friendly enough, but just politically couldn't merge.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we take one more if there's anybody else?
Shani, one married.
Sorry, Con?
Sean, just a question there for Liz on after 1916. I think there was an inquiry held in Cork, and I think that Tom Hales was quite critical of the leadership in Cork and in the role of 1916 and in the surrender of Aram. If you'd like to comment on that, Liz.
Yeah, you're right, Con. Definitely Tom Hales, like he again, he a bit like Madge, he's not backwards coming forwards, he lets them all know. And some people were taken a bit aback by that because of what he was saying about his commanding officers, McSweeney and so on. He was proven right, because the British government couldn't be trusted. Like they totally broke the deal. But then that sort of reinforces then the sort of the determination of the Cork volunteers when the next phase comes, that they were not going to give up anything. And as we know, Cork dominates in the War of Independence. But yeah, he was scathing in his attack on his commanding officers for allowing the surrender of the arms, or the capture of, or the giving up of the arms, and then the capture of those men, including his brothers.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Just one question, just one comment there. Tom Hales was a Fianna Fáil TD, I think in the 30s, but he resigned then from Fianna Fáil because of the threatened execution of the son of Thomas McCurtain. As far as I know, he was a TD for a number of years. But I'd say there's probably another story there really in the family, like that they never really became part of the establishment. They always kind of remained on the fringes really. So I think they were honourable men too, like. And that they kind of
Sorry, Donegal, were they involved? They were very much involved with agriculture and rights for farmers and so on, like that. That never left them like that. What their father sort of instilled in them, they were. That's another part of their activism that never really they give up on either.
Well, my understanding would be that the family have always kind of the achieving of a 32 county Irish free country, Irish nation, like, was their main objective, like, and that, I mean, they took strong decisions when they had to, like, say for example, when Tom resigned. I don't know, he resigned, I think it was in the 40s anyway, that he resigned over that, like, and a number of other TDs, they threatened the Fianna Fáil government that if they executed Republican prisoners that they would have resigned, but I don't think the executions were carried out as a consequence of that. Like, there was other TDs as well. Sean Moylan, they threatened resignation. So they were honourable men, like, they kept their Republican tradition too,
Yeah, and I suppose what was amazing is just when you think of the age of them, they're like so young to be making these decisions and then living with the effects of the decisions that they made. It's like they weren't superhuman or invincible. It had a huge effect on them. And I was just so privileged to be able to that the people of West Cork were so open with me to share the stories that they had, because through the archives and sort of the material that I was researching, you get one aspect of the person, but through the likes of like the communities down across West Cork, they showed me the people who they were as people, and it just totally adds to my understanding, and it just makes it so much sadder, like, but they really are an amazing family, but tip of the iceberg when it comes to families affected by certainly the Civil War.
Okay, Liz, thank you very much.
Sean, can I just make one point, please?
Yes, indeed.
I just wanted to show Liz there in our journal there that we produced in 2019, just before COVID. Paul O'Brien from America found a photograph of in his possessions of Sean Hales dressed in Free State uniform with a black armband, and I don't think this has been published anywhere before. So can I just read the caption that we put on it? Sean Hales at Kinsale Barracks in Free State uniform. Note the black mourning armband and his downcast demeanour. Could this be in mourning for his slain leader, Michael Collins, in late August 1922? Hales would himself be assassinated a few months later on December 7th, 1922. So this was taken by Ellen Crowley of Ballinadee and found amongst her possessions after her death by her son, Paul O'Brien, a unique and human image of Sean Hales, which to our knowledge has not been published previously. So Liz, we'll send you on that if you'd like it, so that's an interesting one that you mightn't have seen before,
And I will say to you, Dermot, thanks a million. And that's Paul O'Brien, who I mentioned at the end, because Paul, fair play, got in touch with me and he sent me the photograph.
Oh, you have it? Okay.
No, well, I didn't get a chance to put it into the presentation, but I just want to say a huge thank you to Paul for sending that. But I want to get a copy of that journal. I want to read that article. So
we'll send you on one. So yeah,
it's
for sure. Yeah. Thanks a million. Thanks for a brilliant presentation, Liz.
No, thank you all. Seriously, thank you all for tuning in and listening. And because look, we'd have nothing, without the audience. And what I really love about doing these talks is I'll always leave with new information, like that photograph from Paul O'Brien. It's brilliant. So I always love doing these talks because I will always leave with new information. So thank you, everyone. Seriously, thank you.
Liz, if we were in a normal setting, I'm quite sure you'd be getting a standing ovation. So thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to be able to sit down here with 75 or 80 people, and we don't have to wear a mask, and we can get all that information transmitted to us. So again, thank you very, very much. And I think we, as locals, have learned a lot from you. Just for to explain to people that the recording of this evening's presentation will be on our website. You can log into www.Kilburton Historical Society. It'll take a day or two before this evening's presentation will be up, but it will be up there, and any evening you can log in and you can play it back and listen to it again, because I'm sure there are a number of people that weren't able to make it tonight and that would love the opportunity to be able to log into it again. Can I just finally finish up on the basis of using the opportunity when we have the audience of mentioning that we, I suppose, like a lot of societies and organizations, had to forfeit a year of historical journal because of COVID. But on Sunday last, we launched our volume 6 of the journal, which is basically the 21-22 historical journal. And I think there's huge credit to Diarmid O'Donovan in particular for his editorial work and the hours he has put into it. And I think a huge thanks also to Colin Cronin for his launch on Sunday. He made the event very easy for people, and we had an outdoor opportunity, socially distanced, and we will start the campaign running close to Christmas to sell it, but it will be available in all shops as of the next couple of days locally. So traditionally people would be used to going in at Christmas to buy it, but it will be in your shops now in the next number of days. And also, if you cannot access it locally, again, if you log on to our website, www.kilburtonhistoricalsociety.com, you can click on Buy Journal, and you can pay with your card, and you can buy the journal, and we'll get it posted out to you. Again, it's a continuation of the previous 5 journals, and I'm no doubt you will find it very, very entertaining and informative. So thank you very much to the audience. Again, we're up at 75, 80 people. Fantastic. I said to you, Liz, we'd have maybe 40. So you're high in the ratings if we're going to go that route. Again, a sincere thanks to you from the Historical Society point from the committee. If you would email me your address, we would gladly post you copies of the journal. And we look forward to being able to maybe speak again in the future. So thank you very much, Liz. And
thanks so much, Sean. Thanks everyone. Thank you so much.
Okay, and good evening to everybody.
Right, Sean. Good night.
Thank you.
Just finished now, yeah.
Thanks, Liz.
The top there on the Hales Sunday.
Liz, I'm not sure if you have transferred the host to me, have you?
Oh, I need to do that. Hang on.
You'll be listening to the West Cork for the next week.
How do I do this now? I heard something like the other day, or where's that now? Wait, Sean. You're on me. I hope you can edit this, Sean. No. Where are you going, Sean?